So, guys, I want to talk about Charlie Kirk's passing. And what I really want to say is that there are a bunch of people who are blaming South Park, or there are a bunch of people saying that, South Park led to his shooting, and they're also pulling the Charlie Kirk episode from syndication. And I do hope that eventually they put the episode back into syndication. It's almost like with The Simpsons, the episode of the World Trade Center where they take it out of syndication for a while, but it was really just like a spoof or just to kind of like make fun of his personality and character. And I actually think that there are a lot of people who are super busy, so it actually helped his popularity a lot more than being a message of that he's a terrible person, really. And ultimately, one of the messages was that if you really are a person that just says controversial things, you definitely just are always hurting on the inside. That's what the theme of the whole episode is, that if you do horrible things for a living for payment, you're gonna regret it, and that could easily be working for ICE like Mr. Mackey was doing, because that's not who he is, or you know how Clyde was, trying to be like Charlie Kirk, really. Honestly, sometimes people regret what they do for money if it is, exploiting or hurting the feelings of others. There are consequences for the life that we live and, what we are good at. But I also feel that that episode had nothing to do with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. You do not see him getting shot in this episode. You don't see people saying, I want to kill this guy or whatever, really. Like, the only thing that is questionable is that when Clyde was being Charlie Kirk, Cartman pounces on him, and then you see him fall back. So that could kind of be, construed as an attack on Charlie Kirk, or that can be even looked at as maybe prophecy, because when he died, he fell over, really. But I don't see that the episode highlighted any violence against Charlie Kirk, or there was anything in it that could have inspired anybody to hurt him, or there was like a scene that was a threat of violence or assassination on him. The other thing that I will say is this kind of goes down to that old argument of, why don't we ban the Bible? Because as Anthony Burgess, the writer of A Clockwork Orange, said, that the Bible has influenced more acts of violence than any other piece in our literature, piece of media in history. Why don't we get rid of, Martin Scorsese films? Because didn't the shooter of Ronald Reagan, wasn't he influenced by Taxi Driver? Why don't we, get rid of, Pokemon and Pokemon cards? Because in the 90s, there are people killing each other over Pokemon cards. Or why don't we get rid of Labubu's right now? Because, and that episode of South Park, because definitely I'm sure there's been fights over that. Why don't we get rid of professional wrestling? Because a lot of times there's been fights at schools and other things like that, really. Why don't we get rid of alcohol? Because alcohol has led to drunk driving and other things like that. Why don't we get rid of sugar? Because sugar has led to like health issues. And I'm very sure, somebody's got killed over sugar or candy or somewhere in their lives, really. Why don't we get rid of pornography? Because some people say that inspires objectification of women and sexual assault of women. So, again, if we get into this trend of just taking things away because we believe it's directed towards something, or because somebody was inspired by a media or a food or a book or whatever, really, to do an act of violence, really, we're just going to go back to that world of banning everything. We're going to go back to the Fahrenheit 9/11 world, or just like how in other countries they have dictatorships where they ban things because they feel like, that's not good for society or whatever. We'll go back to the Hays Code days or whatever, really. But then it's also kind of like what happens a lot, where sometimes, one person does one bad thing and then everybody gets punished for it. I know, when I was a kid, what happened was that there's an episode of The Simpsons where Homer runs for mayor or runs for trash commissioner, and then he signs up, and then it was actually a sex offender officer, and he's like, I mean, he was saying, "Oh, do you want to sign up for registered sex offender?" And Homer's like, "I do," and I was like joking with my brother, saying, "That'd be funny if you were a registered sex offender." I remember my dad saying, "Hey, turn off the television. You guys are not watching The Simpsons anymore." Because my dad was just being really, really uptight. Really, I remember my brother flipping out at me, saying, why can't I watch The Simpsons when, you're the one saying all this controversial, inappropriate shit. You know how my dad is. When you kind of joke around about something. Or I remember there was an episode of The Simpsons where Nelson Muntz and Lisa kiss each other, and legitimately, I think it was Jimbo Jones or one of their kids said, we're gonna take these cupcakes and we're gonna rape we're gonna take this old mayonnaise and we're gonna throw it at Skinner's house. We're gonna rape his house with it. He used the word RAPE. And I remember I was joking around saying that. I didn't know what the word meant at the time because I was really young. My dad made me look up the dictionary. And that was that really. But I remember how that was a good example because I got punished. But but the other time he was like, okay, nobody watched Simpsons in this house because I was joking about the term sex offender. But it goes back to that, how some people are, where it's almost like, we got to ban one thing because one person fucked up, really. Why don't we start banning guns or bullets, or why don't we get back to, responsible gun ownership, why are we not making those changes? But I also will say the other thing, too, is with South Park, they always make fun of everybody, really, a few years ago, they were making fun of PC Principal, PC Babies, which was, PC Principal was the PC culture of millennials and people coming out of college. PC Babies were the children of millennials growing up with, reacting to everything, being spoiled, getting their way, dictating things, or if there's something controversial, they'll just have something to cry about. And then they also were, had Strong Woman, who was a criticism of woke women, how they're hypocrites. On one side, she wants people to be woke and be a good role model of women, but she had a sexual romp with PC Principal, so hypocritical of the ethics, really. So South Park always hits both sides, really. Or even this season, even when you saw the Charlie Kirk episode, they kind of talk about the people who are against Charlie Kirk were a lot of college kids who had arguments, and they're kind of almost saying how they don't argue back that well. Or they don't say, hey, we're not going to move on, we're going to debate this a little bit more. They kind of set themselves up to be taken advantage of or be looked at as fodder, really. So, South Park tries to hit both sides. It's not an anti, just because there's a lot of jokes against Trump and the far left and the far right really doesn't mean that they're anti-left. They're always going to pick the most counterculture side because that's where the money is, if everybody likes, the left side, they're gonna they're gonna be supportive of the right side or be anti-left just because that's where the money is. If people are very pro-right, they're gonna be anti-pro-right, and then they're gonna be pro-left, or they're gonna be anti-pro-right really just because that's where the money is, So it's all about that really. So I think that for a lot of people to say that Matt Stone, Trey Parker are responsible for the death of Charlie Kirk, that's terrible. And I also think that it's a very, very dangerous thing because it can create this, pattern of two things. Number one, censorship. And then another thing, too, is it can inspire other shootings and be like, hey, maybe we need to take out the South Park creators. Oh, well, Mike Judge and Beavis and Butthead, there's a lot of scenes where Beavis and Butthead are older people and they're hurting each other, or you see one's being run over by a rascal. Oh, well, maybe he needs to be taken out because he's celebrating and making fun of elderly abuse or people with mental health issues in old age, really. Oh, well, we need to start taking out people with differences, and that's not the way to go, really, because then again, then nobody can be creative and there can be no art, really, or there can be no challenging side because it's oh, well, every person needs to be taken out, really. So, it's unfortunate, really. We got to just, hold individuals responsible for their individual actions. We also gotta just do enough to say, hey, you know what, we this is not what America is about. America is freedom of speech. It's not about, well, you get killed for freedom of speech. and therefore nobody should be an artist to do whatever they want. Really, I mean, no, like we gotta have consequences, or else we're gonna live in a world of if you do something that's a challenging art, you get killed. Really, and we have to make sure that this is not what this country is about. We have to make sure that this is a country of consequences for people who do horrible things and advocate the First Amendment. And no matter what you feel about Charlie Kirk, good or bad, really, he was an advocate of the First Amendment. And ultimately, it's the action of the shooter and the motivation of the shooter that led to his death. It's not South Park or anything. And if the person was inspired by South Park or any other source, you still gotta blame the shooter because they're the ones who did it. There wasn't a show or whatever saying go do it, and we support that.